Extras.
Normally after the Patreon preview of each Extras video, I include some questions and answers from Patreon in the final video that goes up free for everyone on YouTube. But the Extras Epilogue Prologue thing for Legends the Red Sash was pretty long already, and much more narrative than normal Extras videos. So, with all the good questions I had this time around, I split them into this separate video for you. Warning, questions may have been paraphrased and names of my fictional crap may have had their spelling corrected, because, seriously, how are you supposed to spell my freaky fantasy names? Patreon questions. The playwright asked, you mentioned that Delvash had been shaping orcish culture for decades, if not centuries. What were the orcs like before his machinations? Delvash's effect on orc culture was arguably fairly subtle. Most orcs before and after were weak-willed. This is, of course, before centuries of desert life winnowed them. Just violent brutes and bullies, and like most bullies, they were also insecure cowards. Despite clearly being physically stronger on average than humans, they generally needed to outnumber human forces by 3, 4, 5 to 1 odds in order to win. They tended to break and run if things looked bad in their local section of the battlefield, and of course, they were much more likely to break if they saw other orcs running. Delvash intervened pretty directly and precisely in trying to orchestrate generations of the best and strongest orcs and those otherwise favored by fate, etc., trying to ensure the creation of several super orcs, orcs with massive physical and martial power, but also leadership abilities and ambition. We know that in the end, he got two orcs who could fight toe-to-toe with the greatest elven, human, or Adar heroes. That the Adar disappeared before the Shadow War was an unexpected boon, because though they were far fewer in number than the humans, the average Adar was pretty powerful. But for the rest of orc kind, it would have been too much to change their nature entirely. Instead, Delvash sought to instill in them a belief that the other races were keeping them down, starting legends that they had a historical right to the farmlands of Gruul, and that it was humans and elves who were stopping them from holding other lands on their borders. And finally, he worked to foster in them the desire for a strong leader, which was the easiest shift of all, because it is the natural tendency of bullies to bow to a stronger bully, in order to share a piece of their strength through fear. Delvash needed only to ingrain in the orcs an increased reliance on their bosses, so that seeing themselves as part of their leader's strength would allow them to suppress their natural cowardice, make them more afraid of losing their leader's respect, and more trusting that their leader's strength could protect them even when they see things start to go wrong around them. Of course, this was even easier when their leader was the insanely strong Varharan. Timofey Prezolov asked, did you take any inspiration? Looking forward to any future Shadow War references? TDDC hasn't given much detail on the Shadow War, other than the story of Bialia's curse, but it gets mentioned a lot, if only as a historical yardstick. Although I don't usually look to Tolkien for direct inspiration, when I was setting up my world, I wanted a major historical event that could be seen as important, and that could have a lot of interesting detail around it, but didn't need to, especially early on in the planning and playing the campaign. Something that I could say happened 1,000 years ago, which all players would get, with virtually no explanation, so that I could describe the world as it is now, and everyone would put it in that context. What made sense for that purpose was a Lord of the Rings style conflict, where the orcs and their powerful warlord attacked the world and everyone on a continent had to team up, at least temporarily, to stop them. Therefore, going a little deeper, the tale of Demonac was clearly inspired by Sauron's time in Numenor in the Silmarillion. My world's version is different in countless ways. Unlike Numenor, Korstrad was already a nation on the decline. My version of Sauron and Melkor are actually the same being, and rather than using his charms to tempt the best of men to mess with things that were forbidden, Demonac wanted them to embrace him as ruler of the good side in the conflict that he was causing, and when his time as a mortal was done, he had planned to resume godhood with his mighty heirs ruling over the world. But there's a clear thread from the Silmarillion that I'm mixing with Sauron's side in the War of the Ring here. William Bailey asked, Let's say Delvash had won, and everything had gone to plan. How would things have developed between him and Blibal? Two massive empires, each in the name of different evil and merciless gods. Seems like they'd either get along like a house on fire, or it'd be a third side in a centuries-long civil war with Devonac having to find a way to take on the Super Monitors. Devonac himself wouldn't live to see the real conflict with the KTs. If he lived to 120 or so, there's a good chance his empire would still be missing little bits of the continent. And even if he personally took it all the way, there would be a lot of consolidation required. So it would be his descendants who would have had to take it to the next step. But I don't think Blibal understands, or perhaps doesn't care, that after all she's done for the Diluvians, yes, they worship her, and spill rivers of blood in her name. Hell, the Civil War is a meat grinder that serves her wants almost as much as a united empire would. But after all she's done for them, the requirements of building and controlling a land area, sea area, of that size, an economy so vast, and the oppression of the institution of slavery, all that lawful tyranny is a sort of unofficial worship of Delvash. Had Devonac and his line united the continent under their tyrannical rule, after consolidating and gradually turning the people to worship Delvash directly as a state religion, the inevitable consequence would have been war with the Kuo-toa. These events predate the Civil War by centuries, and it's hard to know if Delvash could have known enough to factor that in, given the errors and incorrect assessments he did make for the future. But in a war between a united Diluvian empire and Devonac's Smith Empire, which it would have been called for maximum political acceptance, Delvash would have turned the whole thing into a Xanatos gambit. If the heirs of Devonac could defeat the Diluvians, then obviously the theocracy of Delvash would have a good chance to conquer the Dragon continents and thus rule the entirety of the Fatelands. But if instead the KTs won, the united continent, once defeated, would almost certainly be entirely conquered by them, creating a different tyranny, which could also move on to span the entire world. Delvash would work very hard indeed to see that they ruled with an orderly iron grip, and though not as good as God Kings with his blood, he would still receive power of worship which may rival Blibal's, even though it was her chosen race. As for Deathman Du and Deathman Unon, they weren't always around, though in the present they are getting on in the years, even for super powerful KT martial arts masters. In the future envisioned by Delvash, this land-sea war would have happened before those two arose, and of course, if the Land Empire had won, there's a good chance they would not have been born, or not had the circumstances they needed to gain their godly powers. Arthur D. Gonzalez Martin asked, so was Hinze a god as well? Also, are the barbarians still around, or will they end up being pushed out by Vistria, or maybe by the KTs going through them to get to Vistria? Korstrat has been relatively safe from direct attack by the Diluvians, because the only ocean access is the Ilude/elf-controlled seas on the east coast, and the frigid northern sea, most of which has a nigh-impassable mountain range between the coast and the land. That distance and low population mean it's less likely that the tribal areas would even have any targets worth sending a monitor for. Most of their problems come from their up-and-down relationship with their harsh climate and the extremely dangerous wildlife in their lands. As far as Hinze, I can't rule out that he had something extra going on. I mean, he seemed heroic beyond what you would expect for a normal human. But in a fantasy world like this, it's still possible he could just be that awesome. But there's no evidence in the stories of any source of powers, except some tales in which, as a hunter early in life, he had an encounter with one of the great animal spirits, which is fairly common in the tales told by the tribes. I will say that he is not an incarnation of a god like Devonac was, or like people believe the woodcutter was in that Smith Legend video. To me, this all means more if this evil god's plans were stopped by a mortal, even if he had some supernatural assistance, like Moradin's craftsmanship, trying to even up the odds. Take that, God of Pride. Jackson Jelinek asked, where exactly did Devonis find Sharganath, the White Dragon? I thought that dragons lived on some other continents of the world, not the one where TDDC takes place. Sharganath's nest, as briefly implied in the video, was amid the northern mountain range. That's still a very wild, largely untouched area, even to this day. Most of the dragons do live elsewhere, but there are almost certainly still some around. Plus, this was a little over 1,000 years ago, and there were even more random dragons nesting on this continent back then. And of course, they can always move around if they feel like it. It can be hard to stop them, particularly if they settle down in some remote and hard-to-reach swamp or mountaintop. Patrick Rooney asked, after the barbarian warrior defeated Devonis, besides putting the rightful king on the throne of Korstrad, did he do anything else of note? Did he ever get involved with the Shadow War, or did he die before it began? Although Hinze went on to many amazing feats and adventures, some told down through the ages in the stories of his people, some not, including several tasks aiding relatives of the dragon, Sharganath, trying to honor her sacrifice in some small way. But there are no known tales of Hinze participating in the Shadow War itself. This is likely because the very beginning of the war was more than 50 years later, and even then it didn't immediately have any major impact on Korstrad itself. If Hinze was an ordinary, albeit very heroic human, there's a pretty good chance he would not have been in fighting form anymore, especially in most of the really significant battles which happened a decade or more after that. Now, even though Devonis was actually older, he would have been in his 80s when the Shadow War started, we know that he was physically about as close as possible to a perfect human from an evil god's point of view. If he'd made it to old age, according to the plans of Delvash, he would have been over 120 years old when he died. And he would have remained much healthier to a much later age than damn near any natural human. And of course, with Devonis leading the Alliance, and in turn being led by his own divine foresight, he would likely have succeeded in killing the Varharan and ending the war much sooner than the 66 years that the Shadow War actually dragged out. And finally, one from a regular YouTube comment. Mortakaten asked, Korstrad is such a mysterious place, none of the PCs are from there or have deep connections there. It's the country you've talked about the least in a sitting, and I'd like to hear even more about it. The short version is that it's been one of the three brother nations since the time of the Smith, but neither Smith nor his son Korstrad really conquered the northern mountains or most of the northeast plains of the area. So Korstrad has really always been two nations, the city dwellers and farmers of the southwest and the nomadic tribes. During eras when they worked together, Korstrad was strong, but during times when they were at odds, it was clearly the weakest of the three brother nations. But not long after the Shadow War, in which King Monoral VI died to much less fanfare than the immortal Eladrin king, the royal line of Korstrad failed altogether, and by the present day, the Winter Palace has fallen into ruin, and the farming communities are a mere shadow of what they once were, just barely hanging on, protected mainly by Vistrian forces who have been stationed there to secure the additional food supply for the mainland. The tribes should always survive, though. Though still amazing hunters, the increasingly brutal beasts of their lands finally forced them to give up the old nomadic ways, building big log forts and settling down. Nowadays, they mostly hunt in large bands in order to take down dire animals and to protect each other from unfriendly spirits, who are much more common than in most of the Fadelands. Their numbers are small, but the men and women of the North remain pretty badass, for similar reasons to the modern-day orcs. Because they have to be. A big thanks to my generous Patreon patrons for caring enough to send me money and ask some good questions. Remember, if you pledge even $1 a month, you get extras videos about a week early, so you have a chance to get your questions answered in the final video. And you also get access to a growing number of MP3s from the TDDC soundtrack that you can download, including the epic boss theme from episode 40 and the Vampire King's theme from the Battle with Mortival. Thanks everyone for watching, and of course, a big shout out to Lord Avon, Duskbar, Big Rin, Gorefiend, and Surf USA, the members of the organization.